modernist movement in Morocco has been studied in recent scholarship as two disparate phenomena. So one that's supporting the colonial political discourse and its mission civilisatrice, which is this civilizing mission, which is to make the locals more civilized. And then the second, which expresses the modernizing aspiration of the newly independent Moroccan state. And in the rare instances in recent scholarship on Moroccan modernism that acknowledge continuity, they're not free from distortion either. In fact, there the relation of the post-independence architectural production to that of the colonial era is very often reduced, like in the work of Jean-Louis Cohen and Moleculaire, to mere elaboration. For example, more specifically in the case of social housing, it is described as improving without introducing any radical changes. So this distortion homogenizes history and denies its agency to the actors and institutions whose practice responded to the ruptures of independence in 1956. Nuance is indeed crucial to the specific context of Morocco, where not only did the political reality encourage the retention of foreign architects and professionals after independence, but also where architectural production from the 1950s to the 1970s was monopolized by the young Moroccan and French architects that composed Groupe Gamma, which stands for Groupe des Architectes Modernes Marocains. Groupe Gamma produced most of Morocco's post-independent public commissions. Gamma stated in modernist architecture more in touch with the specificities of its context, climate, and human habits, thus reverberating the criticism of Siam that were initiated by Team 10 member candidates in a social housing project built under the French colonial rule, such as the Nid d'Abeille or Beehive housing that I'm sure all of you know and that you can see in this exhibition. Formally created in 1951, Gamma was officially defunct after the Siam 11th Congress in 1959. Yet, it continued to informally function as a group throughout the 60s, culminating in its collective effort for the reconstruction of the city of Agadir, which was destroyed by a deadly earthquake in 1959. So my lecture will try to outline continuities in the modernist movement in Morocco through the investigation of the genesis and development of central themes in group discourse. Attention to continuity, however, will not come at the price of ignoring neither the racist colonial agenda that permeated pre-independence architectural production, and it's often conveniently ignored by scholars, maybe a little bit by this exhibition, nor the various appropriations and transformations of key ideas after Morocco's independence. So I will start first by sharing with you a brief history of the genesis of Groupe Gamma. So after World War II, when Siam resumed its activities, it had to face a new geopolitical arena where non-Western contexts, including colonies, emerged as readily industrializing and expanding economic centers with specific urban problems. Within the French colonial territories, Siam groups were successively formed in Algeria by Emery and Maisonneuve in 1947, in Tunisia by the functionalist Bernard Zerfus, and in 1947 too, and in Morocco by Michel Écochard in 1951. Actually, those Siam chapters were led by the junior groups that emerged under the influence and encouragement of the old guard wishing to rejuvenate Siam. This transition, which is often seen as a brutal generational breach, was explicitly planned by Gideon and Gropius, and its roots can be retraced to the 8th Congress in Augustin in 1951, where two new council members were elected from the young generation, namely Candilis and Houel, and the delegate of the junior groups was named Schloss. At this meeting, Écochard, representing Siam Morocco, which was not yet called Gamma, presented under the panel Core of a New Town, the project for the transformation of the squatter settlement into a satellite city of 40,000 inhabitants composed of neighborhood units housing 1,000 people. This project embodied Écochard's urban planning approach, especially as it relates to the rebuilding of shanty towns, or bidonvilles, that were quickly developing near large urban centers. Écochard's plan was characterized by the provision of a new gridded infrastructure of streets and utility lines, of one-story courtyard houses placed on an 8x8 matrix, and a heavy reliance on the systemic analysis of Moroccan traditional types of dwellings. And I'm sure that you can see more about Écochard in this exhibition. Écochard's presentation criticized CM's core precept, since it raised questions about the social dimension of architecture and urban planning. This theme would reverberate with a domineering resonance in the next CM meeting in Aix-en-Provence. Écochard, who was the director of the town planning department of the French Protectorate in Morocco from 1946 to 1952, has been instrumental at initiating and shaping an organized CM group in Morocco. First contacted by Gideon in December 1947, 2 years after their meeting in New York, Écochard accepted his invitation to make a contribution to the next CM Congress in Pergamon. He was then a simple member and took part in the plenary session chaired by Le Corbusier on the application of the Athens Charter, along with Georges Candilis, who was the project architect for Le Corbusier Unité d'Habitation in Marseille. The Moroccan group was then considered in a formative stage, a category that was created at the Bridgewater Congress to encompass the Algerian and Tunisian CM groups. Several letters sent by Écochard from 1947 to 51 that urged Moroccan architects to form a CM group demonstrate his dedication to this mission. He failed at first to get the attention of the Moroccan architectural scene, whose different allegiances mirrored the split in metropolitan French between the followers of Lotz, Le Corbusier, and the group La Cité. Yet, the lectures of the prominent CM members Lotz and Bodiensky in 1949 in Casablanca, coupled with the visits of Lotz in 51 and the arrival of Georges Candilis that same year, precipitated the formation of a 10-group person in Morocco. Candilis was then a young member of the CM Council, and he came to Morocco to run the Atbat Afrique architecture office in Morocco after working on the Unité d'Habitation in Marseille. And finally, it is only at the end of CM9 Congress in Rodendam in 51, after Écochard's rite of passage presentation, that Gamma was officially accepted as a legitimate subgroup of CM. Starting from September 51, the group Gamma, presided by Écochard, started to meet once a month, alternatively in Rabat and Casablanca, in its members' houses and offices. The combination of Écochard and Candilis with vibrant local architects who left Morocco before 1939 for their education in Europe and returned after the war, such as Elie Azaguri and Jean-François Zevaco that you can see here, created a very fertile environment for the formulation of Gamma's ideas. Aside from this intellectual milieu, their discourse was influenced by the country's economic condition, wavering between economic prosperity and rapid pauperization of its urban fringes, wavering and a condition which on one hand spurred the reconsideration of CM's universalist precept, and on the other provided the financial means to implement those new approaches. Hence, the generation of housing solutions for the largest member, breaching from the universalizing Athens Charter, and the tackling of social issues and cultural specificities were at the very core of those early Gamma efforts. Their materialization necessitated the invention of and experimentation with new research methodologies and formal vocabularies. The socially inclined approaches, mainly developed by Écochard and the Atbat Afrique office, ran against the conservative views of the colonial administration, who ignored problematics related to the natives. And ultimately, it led sadly to the fall of their instigators, such as Écochard, yet without having crystallized a solid platform for both future experimentation and a certain depoliticized form of urban planning. These themes will persist after independence in Gamma's discourse and projects. The groundbreaking character of urban planning and architecture developed by Gamma did not start with the formation of the group, and rather was introduced by Écochard arrival in Morocco. Indeed, Écochard instigated an approach to urbanism that departed from the pre-war era, where natives were neither confined to their medinas, so the traditional walled city, or resigned to live in squalid shanty towns. The massive rural exodus that resulted from the rapid growth of the industrial sector was simply ignored by the protectorate power, which shifted the responsibility to industrialists. In reality, only few of them provided housing quarters to workers, yet those remained insignificant relative to the gargantuan demand. The Moroccan urban population has indeed swelled by 232% from 1930 to 1946. Écochard immediately recognizes crucial the problematic of habitat for the larger number, which he saw as a matter both of technology and of conscience of France. The signature by Bodiansky of a UN Charter for Habitat for the larger number further legitimized Écochard's concern among the Moroccan political sphere and the CM platform. New experimental methods were required in order to properly address the Moroccan shanty towns. Since their European counterparts, if already at the crux of Louis' seminal, Can Our City Survive?, had widely differing characteristics and thus could not serve as precedents. Écochard devised a very clear urban planning framework to root those experiments, broadly based on two key concepts. The first one is the knowledge of the social and physical characteristics of the local context, which should rely on sociological and building surveys to shed light on the human groups in all, I quote, of their daily realities, be they pleasant or toilsome, as well on cartographic and statistical analysis to identify the city's fundamental tendencies, its fundamental trait which never loses either its strength or its right. End of quote. Écochard multidisciplinary teams pursue the legacy of extensive anthropological and sociological work that had been initiated since the early 30s by scholars such as Robert Montagne, a geographer, and his assistant Pierre Mas and André Adam, who performed multiple on-field surveys and data collection. The second concept underlying Écochard's approach is his consideration of history and evolution. The architect distilled his approach as follows, I quote, "Seize a passing opportunity, take advantage of a fleeting moment of support, then waste time arguing." This position led to an urban planning dialectic. On one hand, touch the existing city as little as possible by limiting the development to the large arteries vital to the city life and growth, and on the other, define the size and armature and study in the greatest detail the housing projects and zones meant for development. Écochard applied these ideas on an 8-meter by 8-meter grid and introduced a neighborhood unit where the amount of infrastructure is limited in order to leave space for more open spaces. Also, the Medina's pedestrian network, cul-de-sac access, and courtyard dwelling typologies were applied to the unit of Écochard. The impact of Écochard's ideas and methods among Gamma's members was potent. First, his influence is most visible in the composition of the group, which comprised in 1952 15 members whose expertise included sociology and geography. Second, Écochard's reform of the administrative system of the urbanism department heavily depended on hired consultant for projects. As such, this organizational model effectively disseminated Écochard's ideas even throughout the private sector and generated a platform where Gamma's members could deploy architectural experimentation necessary to answer the new problems of the housing for largest number. In particular, the rehousing of the shantytown Carrière Centrale that took place between 1951 to 1955 involved several Gamma members, such as Afrique Bodiansky, Condilis, Woods, and Student. Finally, Écochard's theme of predilection, habitat for the largest number, was prevalent in the majority of the minute notes of the meetings of Gamma. For instance, it appeared in a vast array of instances such as debates on social housing, and low-cost construction techniques, the discussion of completed or ongoing housing projects, and their projected publication. From a seminar in Geneva regarding emergency housing, Écochard brought back a translated report to Gamma members in Morocco and encouraged them to review it and discuss it for the next meeting. Yet, Écochard authority started to be challenged during the preparation of the 1953 CMT Congress, where his apologetic support of the Athens Charters and his presentation grade steered some opposition among Gamma members. The criticism, led by Cheminot and Candilis, two Gamma members, was about the need for a new definition of habitat that went beyond the dwelling unit, and also about presentation grid that would be more adapted to highlighting their multidisciplinary approaches. While Écochard's groundbreaking, socially conscious work had no doubt shaped Gamma's discourse, it had an even more critical impact during the Aix-en-Provence Congress in '53. Gamma's great incensed by other members, especially the Smithsons, broke with the traditional organization and displayed images of shanty towns and vernacular Moroccan dwellings. Its seemingly anti-establishment, I could even say anti-colonial attitude, is undermined, however, by an incipient segregation. Indeed, under Écochard, specific housing typologies were designed for each ethnic group: the Muslims, the Jews, and the Europeans, along an evolving spectrum of civilization. As such, the delineation of those groups' characteristics and needs, despite being backed up by rigorous field research, could not avoid generalizing pitfalls. What is often ignored is the orientalizing underlay of Siam's discourse that Zeynep Selik justly noticed in the Siam Alger grid, presented as well at the Siam 9 Congress, and which dealt with similar shantytown problems. I love this slide. This undertone is most noticeable in Écochard's famous diagrams that were part of the Siam 9 Moroccan presentation, and in which Muslims are shown as needing to evolve from shantytown to patio houses to mid-rise housing blocks, where actually they were all dreaming of the housing blocks straight away. In fact, the inhabitants of the studied shantytown were not countryside dwellers, but Moroccans well acquainted to the urban realm and begging for modern dwellings similar to the ones designed for the European population. The uncritical embrace of introversion for Muslim dwelling reiterates a common cliché on privacy and the seclusion of women, which in the context of modernizing Casablanca should have been more accurately assessed. Hence, Écochard's work, and by extension Gamma thoughts in the pre-independence era, are marked by the oversimplification and generalization of existing conditions, along with an uncritical bipolarization between colonizers and colonized, and as such can be seen as a tributary of persisting Orientalist imagery and preconceptions. Thus, if somewhat challenged by Écochard, the civilizing mission of French rule, which justified occupation by debasing colonized population as inferiors in need of assistance, is still vividly echoed in Écochard's ideas. The archaic form of indigenous dwellings, even though upgraded through the addition of proper sanitation and a rational grade layout, was still the paradigm in Écochard's low-cost housing, which merely contained a room, a patio, a faucet, and a Turkish toilet, so no bath, no shower. Summoning the constraining budget, it was totally insensitive to the large size of the Moroccan families, condemning them to live in a crowded condition. Interestingly, despite being the only colonial same group to have a native member, namely Aziza Chaouni, Gamma remained apolitical to a certain degree, as it never questioned the colonial power in place, and only criticized its neglect of locals' problems. This apolitical inclination extends to Siam at large, since no Congress ever tackled the issues of colonialism. This complete silence is startling, especially in 1950s context, where mounting anti-colonial movements were numerous, most notable of all the surrealists, who had famously challenged the colonial exhibition as early as 1936. In an interview I had with Aziza Chaouni before he passed away, he stated that some of Gamma's members were fervent opponents of the colonial rule, but it was in the closet because they kept their opinion private, as the group comprised several architects and planners working for official colonial services such as Fauchereau. Even when Écochard was dismissed from his job in December 1952, this detachment vis-à-vis the colonial question lingered, while habitat for the largest number still remained a central focus in Gamma's discourse. So after Candelay's departure in April 1954, Cheminot, a French architect, was appointed as Gamma's primary delegate until 1957, so he stayed even after Morocco's independence, which was very unusual in the French colonies. And then Moroccan architect Aziza Chaouni took charge of Gamma's leadership. Meetings were mostly happening informally in his office or house, but Corbushin's core concept remained very strong. This referencing discarded the raging criticism CM was receiving at that time in Europe, and veiling the persisting influence of Écochard's legacy more than the direct influence from the dwindling CM's movements. After Aziza's attendance of the CM11 meeting in Otterlo, the group ceased to officially exist. That was in 1959. But actually, after I did investigate the matter, it appeared that it remained intellectually active, keeping monthly meetings. It is described by its surviving members, I mean actually they're all dead now, so when I did interview them, they were all still surviving, more like informal discussions and site visits among friends. So they would discuss their favorite projects, for example. But in 1960, actually in 1959, the Agadir earthquake and the subsequent unique national reconstructing effort enabled the Gamma veterans, along with the new generation of Moroccan-born architects, such as Faraoui, de Mazière, Ben Barak, and Amzalai, to coalesce and work collectively on an entire cities and apply for the first time their ideas on an urban scale. Backed up by an efficient administrative apparatus, the Commission for the Reconstruction and a progressive young leader, 27-year-old Mourad Ben Barak, that was educated in France, and then the head of the Ministry of Habitat, the reconstruction gave birth to a very specific aesthetic that resulted as much from the experimental vein inherited from pre-independence Gamma as from the technical requirement of earthquake regulation. Actually, until this day, if you go to Agadir, the concrete used in all of the building looks amazingly beautiful. Ben embarked, so he was the lead of this reconstruction, started publishing in 1964 the first post-independence architectural magazine, A+U, whose main concern intersect in a very continuous manner pre-independence Gamma issues of habitat for the greatest number as they relate to the demographic growth, the study of vernacular architecture, its ongoing change and dynamic, as well as urban, geographical, and sociological emerging patterns. And like other newly independent countries, many French professionals, including architects, planners, landscape architects, administrators, and engineers, remained in Morocco after its independence in 1956. There was thus continuity not only of the administrative bodies, but also a professional organization, such as the Order of Architect or Group Gamma, that allowed for a bridging of the architectural discourse between the pre- and post-independence eras. Also, Morocco modernizing nationalism was in line with Gamma's progressive ideas that survived throughout Écochard's city master plans that would continue to be executed until the late 70s in Morocco. Finally, after the independence, the young generation of Moroccan architects, spearheaded by Aziza Chaouni, who was promoted to leadership role, was impregnated with modernist ideals they inherited from their education abroad or internship under Gamma members. I shall outline now how the theme of housing for the largest number has evolved after Morocco's independence amid Gamma. Even though construction slowed down significantly after independence, habitat for the largest number remained a priority and permeated post-1956 Gamma's discourse. Some shantytown rehabilitation project initiated under the French protectorate would indeed continue until the 1960s. However, the general approach to housing changed dramatically from the protectorate period. Moroccans were finally granted fully European-style high-rise housing without the token patio and the lack of bathrooms, as the phenomenon of acculturation was seen as less of a threat to local culture. Also, among Moroccans, the access to such dwelling with European comfort allowed them to appropriate and inhabit modernity. The vertical dwelling as a symbol for the entrance into modernity is an ambiguous concept. However, since it holds a strong negative reference to the colonizing power, while being simultaneously the symbol for modernizing independent Morocco. I shall briefly mention now 3 housing projects that demonstrate the new development in Ghana's thoughts on low-cost dwelling, particularly as they relate to the changing user pattern, usage of local materials, and their reinterpretation of the past. The first housing project that was built after Morocco's independence was a housing ensemble in the neighborhood of the Plateau in Casablanca, designed by Gaston Joubert, a Gamma member, in collaboration with Pierre Coldefi. It is composed of a long, sinuous 5-story bar composed of 262 units and 4 shorter 3-story bars composed of 48 units each, without courtyards. The ensemble followed one of Écochard's tenets, limiting the investment on common infrastructure and instead focused on the quality of public open space and the building itself. The facades are articulated with alternating panels, creating L-shaped patterned windows, a rhythm and surface play that is reminiscent of Cantonese aesthetic. The organization of the interior spaces is the most representative of this change in approach. I'm sorry, I'm lacking the plans here. In fact, services are flanked along the circulation corridor in order to produce large living spaces that benefit from the most exposure to sun and ventilation. Finally, the kitchen is sometimes open to the living area to attenuate its constrained size, and the bathrooms, always relegated to secondary importance in post-independent schemes, gain here generous proportions and also a modern toilet seat rather than a Turkish toilet. I know it is a detail, but that actually is a pretty important detail. The second notable example of Gamma's new approach to housing is Dirigé, known today as Hai Hassani, which was a shanty town in its first stage of rehousing, where dwellings were arranged in a grid layout with basic amenities but no sewers. After it was burned down by angry inhabitants, tired of waiting for improvements, Aziza Chaouni, who was still the head of Gamma, was commissioned to produce 25,000 dwellings for Dirigé. While using Écochard 8x8 meter grid, his master plan turned away from the stage 2 rehousing recommendations that advocated an endless map of high-density, single-story courtyard houses accessible through 2-meter wide blind alleys. Instead, his master plan was more airy, as you can see here, with more open spaces and presented different housing typology. So you can see here you have bars, you have mat buildings, and also you have a market, central market, and then a school and a mosque as well. And actually, this scheme, the master plan scheme, was innovative in 2 respects. First, on the level of the 2-family dwelling units, its iterative arrangements are very diverse despite set commonalities. Each unit had either a loggia or a terrace, and at least a 9-meter square kitchen, 2 9-meter square rooms, and a 1.5-meter square bathroom. The privacy of each dwelling in the unit was resolved by opening windows onto the street, transcending the stereotypical introverted typology of dwellings for Muslims prevalent in colonial Morocco. Second, Aziza's innovation lied on the level of the clustering, since his units employed carefully placed setbacks that could allow for potential expansions. mainly in the form of the covering of the outdoor areas and courtyards, without endangering the sanitation requirements of the cluster. Accordingly, Azague's two-story units were organized in swastikas, or called basal type, in an undulating figure called the arsen type, that you can see here on the right, or also shifted in new figures, called the maxim type. And you can see here an aerial view of the project that was still under construction. And what is important to note is that in Dirigé, Azagué integrated for the first time in the low-budget domestic unit the notion of evolution and growth, a concept which Écochard was not interested in implementing, even if it did happen in his project, while Candelis advocated for it in the Carrière Centrale without fully resolving it. You can indeed see in Ito Berada's beautiful photos in the current exhibition, and also in my own photo here, how the hanging courtyards of Candelis building Nid d'Abeille on the left-hand side are today walled. You can see them on the right-hand side. Since the covering of the Nid d'Abeille hanging pastures was unforeseen, the units resulted in dark, unventilated units, and Candelis sought after modes of habitation appropriation remain unclear and resolved. Interestingly today, all units of Azague's Dirigé, in contrast, expanded exactly as he had predicted. However, their growth and self-construction by the inhabitant has mitigated results, since issues of safety of construction, daylighting, and ventilation are common. The outcome from the Dirigé experimentation was to be later incorporated in prototype units by the independent Moroccan Ministry of Public Works. The third and last project in Zevaco's 20-row courtyard houses for low-income civil servants that he completed in 1965, and for which he received the Aga Khan Award for Architecture in 1980. Zevaco designed the whole complex where the row courtyard houses are set, which comprises a school, a park, a small sitting area with benches, and three-story housing blocks. Sadly, I won't have time to get into the other buildings, but they're actually amazing in their own right. You should check them out. The limited budget required an organization of the housing project in two blocks. One with 6 type A, so type A is 3-bedroom units, and 4 type B, 4 bedrooms that had 4 bedrooms. So this is block 1. And in block 2 was composed of 7 type B and 3 type A. This constraint inevitably led to 2 orientation for the A and B dwelling typologies, and one was always detrimental. To palliate this difficulty, Zevaco investigated how the patio could be reinterpreted to allow for a double exposure of each room, leading to its explosion into 6 outdoor spaces. So you have an entrance patio, 2 private-oriented patios, a living room patio, a kitchen terrace, and a service courtyard. This multiplicity of courtyards, each with a specific function, extending the interior programs into the outdoors, has proven very successful as it weaves landscape with the domestic realm and separates service patios from the leisure-oriented ones. You can see here the aggregation in block 1 of units A and B, each with its own plan and number of bedrooms, and also specific courtyard organization that allow for double daylight exposure of all of the rooms. Thus, and like previous gamma work, like Candelis or Écochard, Carrière Centrale, you can see the 2 plans compared here, the patios acquires a spatial complexity, which leads to formal innovation. Rather than a space reduced to its orientalizing imagery and ventilation role, the patio gains in Zevaco's row houses, all its hidden potential as a multivalent space that defines a new mode of living. Besides, the number of bedrooms and the presence of a full bathroom respond to the need of Moroccan urbanites, while enabling their right to modernity. Surprisingly today, Zevaco's row houses, and all of them, have actually undergone no major changes. I visited all of them. All courtyards are still used as such and are actually lush and cared for. Besides Écochard's housing for the greatest number, his anthropological field research approach remained a leitmotif in most post-independence Gama's work. At the heart of Écochard's anthropological approach lies the study of vernacular architecture. Indeed, Écochard's team not only looked at shantytown habitats, but also at rural vernacular architecture, actually ignoring the urban vernacular in Morocco, which is the Medina. The Medina is a walled medieval city. The Medina was indeed perceived as the arena of the colonial 1920s and 1930s period, which adopted a historicist style called arabisance, so you can see displayed here, that Gama rejected altogether. The fascination for the shantytown and the southern rammed-earth kasbahs by colonial Gama was driven by the search for cultural and environmental specificity in order to understand the pattern of spatial usage fit with local customs. Conversely, post-independence Gama was interested in the vernacular not only for the urgency to perpetuate its tradition, albeit in altered formats, but most importantly for learning from its forms, its adaptation to climate, and its constructive methods in order to develop a new modern habitus and identity for the newly decolonized Moroccans. In the first issue of A+U, the editorial board urges the modernist architect to research vernacular architecture, since it will form a fertile base for his or her work, since its volumes, plans, and materials can be viewed as modern. And by vernacular architecture, they meant all types of vernacular architecture in Morocco, including the Medina. Thus, with its latent capacities to inform modern praxis, vernacular architecture acquires with post-independence Gama an expanded role. Not only are its cultural specificities studied, but also its architectonic, environmental, and social specificities in order to construct an entirely new lifestyle and identity for Moroccans. This paradigm shift can be seen in the administrative and educational buildings designed by Gama members and commissioned by the state or by private organisms, such as the Mission Culturelle Française. These projects are best exemplified by Zevaco's schools, which display a strong sculptural investigation of concrete, the interplay of cantilevers, loggias, and shadows. His aspirations to take the local into consideration appears in his meticulous treatment of details, such as windows, stairs, and apertures, that he designed and implemented in close collaboration with local craftsmen. The first issue of A+U initiated its architect feature series with an examination of Zevaco, whose work was justly recognized as adequately bridging between modernism and Morocco's cultural and geographical specificities, which underlay not only Gama's early concerns, but also the métissage advocated later by Gideon and Frampton's definition of regionalism. However, it was not until the reconstruction of Agadir in 1959 that this métissage would be most clearly articulated, resulting in an aesthetic whose coherence has been overlooked by scholars. The dominant description of Morocco's post-independence architectural production as heteroclite, at best loosely tied by a common interest in modernism. As such, his approach often obscures crucial overarching ideas that may be crystallized during the reconstruction of Agadir and incorporated two of Gama's core concepts: context integration and experimentation. Agadir's reconstruction allowed Gama members, along with young newcomers such as Faraoui, de Mazière, Ben Barak, and Amsalah, to closely collaborate on a common project, capitalizing on Morocco's young nation state to construct a modern image. Thereby, they shaped an aesthetic enabled and framed by a reconstruction commission that closely linked urbanism with architecture and local specificities. Interestingly, while Agadir's urban approach resulted in a conventional functionalist master plan based on separating programmatic zones, its clear guidelines helped enforce a rigorous common language that permitted ingenuity and experimentation at the same time. The language was characterized by a strong emphasis on the expression of the tectonic, the contrasting alternation of concrete surfaces and white plain, reminiscent of both Candilis, the steel-like vocabulary, and of earlier work of Gama. The integration of shadows in the design of the facade, and subtle integration of traditional materials and techniques. This language is well embodied in the long-housing bar, immeuble A, designed by Testament and Hélène Castelnau, and in the market in Agadir by Farley and de Mazière. Paradoxically, the most significant innovation of this aesthetic, that is, the subtle inclusion of local materials and techniques, is obscured at first by the massive presence of the concrete structural elements. For instance, local cedar wood is often used by these architects, like in the interior of Zevaco's post office. You can see stools here. At last, the desert hotels of Farley and de Mazière, built between 1965 and 1970, beautifully reinterpret local urban typologies named Daksar, which is, oh, the image is missing. I wish it was here. Sorry about that. Which is a rammed earth walled village. I'm sure you can imagine a beautiful rammed earth village from southern Morocco, composed of courtyard houses called kasbahs. For instance, the Hotel Boulman, designed in 1965, overall massing, and its organization around the central courtyard that you can see here around the pool, and narrow circulation systems echo key organizational elements of the kasbah. Furthermore, the architects integrated woodwork by craftsmen and painted woodwork by contemporary artist Farid Belkaria in all of the public spaces of the hotel. This painting was reminiscent yet different from those found on the ceiling of kasbahs in southern Morocco. And now, so the study of the forces that have shaped the discourse and architectural and urban production of Group Gamma has offered a privileged lens through which to view and gauge the modern movement in Morocco. The nuanced perspective it affords challenges the rupture usually perceived between the colonial and the independence eras. I hope that it is now clear to you that for the colonial period, the architectural production based along ethnic stereotypes cannot be fully divorced from the colonial segregationist agenda, despite its will and humanitarian intent to tackle the multiple issues of indigenous housing. Similarly, the quest of independent Morocco for a modern image, a mission and emphasizing all issues of the magazine A+U, had a potent impact on Gamma's post-independence production. The singularity and cohesiveness of the architectural discourse and production generated by Gamma after the independence begs for the reconsideration of the primacy given to 1950s Morocco as a laboratory for European modernism. Instead, the period should be also acknowledged as the catalyst for the development of Moroccan post-colonial modernism. However, the peculiarity of the modernism developed in the aftermath of the Moroccan independence quickly gave way at the end of the 1960s to a brutalist aesthetic, leaving many investigations incomplete and burgeoning themes unexplored. Today, Gamma's ideas are still very timely and should be reconsidered by the young Moroccan avant-garde that is stumbling to define a contemporary, locally rooted architectural language. Thank you very much.
I was wondering if you could sort of make the link between Hench and Studer and Gamma, because it always seems kind of like a wild card. Like they're Swiss, they did, in like nearby neighborhood, but not too nearby, similar projects, which one is sort of like built up and added on, the other is kept almost as it was built.
Well, yeah, I mean, what's interesting about Studer is that he appears in some of the minute notes of the meeting, but he's not a person who's been continually present. So kind of I see him more of an independent person. So he was present at some of the meetings of Gamma. He never actually made a comment. I don't know if he was shy or not because it was in the meeting notes. It was you would see who says what, right? And so I would say that yes, he shared with them many ideas and so forth. So this is as far as I know of his implication. And then regarding the changes to his buildings, I'm not very familiar about clearly what has changed. I didn't study them in detail. But for sure, kind of the type of housing he proposed also didn't have, just had a Turkish toilet, didn't have a bathroom, because it was assumed that the Moroccans would go to the public bath, which they had actually already started, they stopped doing. My own grandparents would tell me, and they were quite unhappy, like not to have a bathroom, etc., right? And not to have, units that had enough number of rooms, because, it was ignored that Moroccans, on average, had 5 kids to 6 kids at that time. So I think that his own approach was very much tinted by the general approach that Écochard had or other Gamma member had at the time, which had this colonial tint to it. Yeah.
In fact, I will ask a question in French, if possible.
Yes, oui, sans problème.
Ma première question, c'est le mouvement moderne d'architecture moderne. En France, a créé beaucoup de problèmes. Des problèmes de débat qui ont été créés en France, qui ont engendré beaucoup de problèmes sociaux. On sait tous ce qui a été fait en France. Les bars ont été construits à l'extrémité de la ville, à l'extérieur de la ville ancienne. Avec toutes les problématiques, ça a créé aussi, il y a eu tout le mouvement moderne avec sa pensée. Les fonctions ont été vraiment séparées. L'habitation, le travail, le loisir, donc ça a été séparé. Est-ce qu'au Maroc, ça a créé le même problème? Est-ce que ça a connu le même problème qu'en France? Puis on sait qu'en France, on est en train de réfléchir, on le fait d'ailleurs, c'est la démolition des bars. Le professeur travaille sur la démolition des bars. Est-ce qu'on est dans ce mouvement, est-ce qu'on est arrivé à la hausse au Maroc?
D'accord, alors je peux répondre donc, à cette question. Donc, d'après mon expérience à Casablanca et à Agadir, ce qui s'est passé, c'est que Dirigé, par exemple, qui est maintenant appelé Hassani, qui avant était à la périphérie de la ville, maintenant se retrouve, comme la ville a énormément grandi, se trouve au cœur de la ville. Donc en fait, les problèmes qui existent en France, c'est que ces bars en général sont réellement très loin du centre de la ville. Donc ça, c'est un problème. Et dans Agadir même, comme la ville a été conçue dès le départ sur une table rase, ces bars et ces logements sociaux que vous avez vus sont en fait localisés dans la ville même. Donc en fait, ces problèmes de distance entre la ville, de séparation de travail ne sont pas aussi énormes. Donc ça, je pense, c'est la réponse numéro 1. La réponse numéro 2, c'est qu'il y a d'autres problèmes qui existent aussi bien en France dans les bars qu'ici. Je dirais qu'un des problèmes majeurs, c'est les espaces publics qui ne sont pas maintenus, qui sont en général sales, qui sont dangereux, etc.
La composition sociologique, c'est quoi la composition sociologique de ces bâtiments?
Aujourd'hui, je dirais que ceux de Casablanca, par exemple à Hassani, en général, il y a eu plusieurs générations. Donc c'est les mêmes familles qui sont restées. Et quand ce n'est pas les mêmes familles, en fait, ces familles ont déménagé, mais elles louent encore leur maison. Et je dirais c'est une classe moyenne basse. Alors qu'à Agadir, je dirais que c'est une classe beaucoup plus faible que celle de Casablanca. Parce que le quartier reste, parce que les logements restent chers, parce qu'ils sont dans la ville, ils sont très proches. Voilà.
Dernière question, ce que je vois dans le mouvement au Maroc, si je comprends bien, c'est que les architectes ont pris en considération la population. Donc, vraiment, l'origine de la population, en fait, c'est contre le mouvement moderne où on ne prend pas en compte la personne et sa culture.
En fait, je dirais que c'est un petit peu plus subtil, parce que dans le mouvement moderne, avant l'indépendance, Écochard et ses collègues ont pris en considération. Mais seulement, ils ont pris en considération à travers une sorte de perspective assez coloniale. C'est-à-dire que pour eux, ils ont généralisé, ils ont dit que tous les migrants ou tous les gens qui habitent dans les bidonvilles viennent de la campagne, donc ce qui veut dire on va étudier leur logement dans la campagne et on va leur fournir un logement hybride qui mélange leur maison de campagne et leur logement structure sociale de campagne avec des idées modernes. Mais cependant, ce qu'ils ont ignoré, c'est que la plupart de ces gens ne voulaient pas vivre dans leur maison de campagne, voulaient une salle de bain, ne voulaient pas aller au bain public, voulaient une vraie cuisine, ne voulaient pas juste une cuisine dans un patio, etc. Donc je dirais que la grande différence pour moi, c'est que le groupe qui est après l'indépendance de Gamma, et parfois c'est les mêmes personnes qui sont restées, c'est ça ce qui est intéressant. Mais sous l'indépendance du Maroc, ils ont fait répandu une partie au marché numéro 1 à la demande, c'est-à-dire que ces Marocains, ils voulaient une grande salle de bain, etc., ne voulaient pas de patio parfois, etc. Mais je pense que la deuxième chose qui est importante, c'est qu'ils étaient dans une perspective d'un Maroc qui voulait donner, donc d'abord sous Mohamed V puis sur Hassan II, une image moderne. Et je pense que c'est pour ça qu'ils se sont éloignés des modèles coloniaux.
Mais ça commence à être perçu par le Corbusier lui-même, parce qu'en fait c'est une trahison aux idées jusciennes en fait.
En fait, le Corbusier est venu à Agadir, en fait, quand il y a eu le tremblement de terre, et il a laissé, en fait, je vais le montrer, un petit dessin, et où il a écrit « Faites une ville moderne ». Et en fait, il a eu une discussion avec le roi, et ils ne se sont pas entendus, et il est reparti directement. Mais ce que lui en pensait, je pense qu'il était à un moment où lui-même il percevait que le mouvement moderne devait changer. Donc, lui-même, dans ses projets donc, en Algérie, etc., en Inde aussi, avait donc une idée donc, du modernisme qui devait évoluer. Voilà.
You have a question?
I came a little late, perhaps you introduced, so when Écochard becomes all supreme, he's answering to the orders of the administrative rulers.
Yeah.
And at the same time, there is another even higher level of command, $1.1 billion for 10 cities to be rebuilt through Marshall Plan would be more than what we would be giving to, say, the Ukraine today. So there are some other norms that somebody is trying to set up. And what you have raised about this bathroom idea, my colleagues were working here in Montreal the same time. In Point St. Charles, people didn't have bathrooms. So the norms which you are trying to bring in, perhaps what was expected of, were they really driven by this colonialist thinking, or it was some other kind of abstract planning norm that he is trying to build up? That's my kind of...
I think that you're right, but however, we have so
and
many...
it is 1946.
Yeah. Sorry?
It's 1946.
Where?
Maybe even in Paris, people didn't have bathrooms when I started going there myself as a young student
But this
of
was
architecture.
but this was 1954.
The original grid which we have started to discuss when he becomes the Supreme is 1946.
47, yes.
Yeah.
Indeed. But I think, I agree with you that there are many forces that shape, the design of an architectural plan. But however, in the case of Écochard, this exhibition is showing there are so many proofs, let's say, or like examples, because he tried to justify his designs by scientific proof, by sociological and anthropological. Right, and I think this is where I think it becomes a little bit ambiguous, right? Because he's using this new technique to have sociologists and geographers and anthropologists to go and study the villages where this population are coming from. And actually in the exhibition there are these beautiful charts, like that they will give to the field investigators, where they would mark all of the details of people live, how many kids they have, etc. And I think because he has tried to justify his design by all this scientific statistics and data, I would say that probably...
You didn't see bathrooms.
Sorry?
You didn't show bathrooms.
In his own analysis, of course, he would see that people would use public bath. That was the practice. But is it what they wanted?
Was it in the villages public baths? No.
In where? Sorry?
In the villages where people came from?
Of course, there were public baths.
No.
In Morocco? Well, are you from Morocco?
No, I'm
Have
not.
you been to this? So how can you make those statements? I'm sorry to say.
No, but this kind of jumping that every village had a public bath. where from people came.
Yeah.
So he doesn't do that. Then why he didn't do that? That is what is my question.
I don't understand what you're saying.
Because-
Why he didn't do public bath? No, he did propose public bath. That's what he did. That's what he has in those Caraïbes Centrales.
Yeah.
Exactly. But people started not to go to the public bath. My own grandparents. This is what I'm trying to say. Is that there was a change in people's mentality that was faster than what was proposed. That's all I'm
This
saying.
is what I'm trying to say. There is a décollage.
Yeah, but then, no, but for the housing for the very poor, low-cost Europeans, they had a bathroom. So if we follow, like your mode of thinking, if it was just about, kind of the general idea of social class and socio-economic income, and condition, then even the Europeans in Morocco of the lowest class should also go to the public bath, right? And should
That's
also
what
have a
we did
Turkish
here.
toilet.
And we lost it
No,
very
but
quickly.
listen, I'm not speaking about here. I'm speaking about Morocco specifically as a context. You cannot mix,
No, I know in detail what happened to public baths here. I don't know what happened to public baths in Morocco. So I'm just trying to illustrate that this disconnect is a very profound one socially in sanitation and bathroom standards. And this is continuing. That's all I'm questioning.
I do get it, but I think it's very important to set up a question always in its context. I mean, otherwise we speak abstractly.
Excusez-moi, les grands-parents ont arrêté d'aller au bain.
En fait, ils allaient, mais préféraient, parce que parfois les conditions étaient un peu sales, etc., ils préféraient eux-mêmes recréer, par exemple, au lieu d'aller, par exemple,
À la main.
donc, dès qu'ils avaient donc, de l'argent, c'était un signe de bourgeoisie, c'est d'avoir son propre main à la maison. Voilà.
Vous avez encore une question?
Ouais.
Alors,
En fait, à chaque fois qu'on parle de ce problème, je pense toujours à Hassan Fatih. Hassan Fatih, pour essayer, il a écrit Construire avec le peuple.
Oui.
Et lui, le village qu'il a construit, il a réfléchi vraiment avec le peuple. Donc, il a vraiment tenu compte du mode de vie des personnes et des maisons étaient en fonction de ça. On voit pas. Est-ce que, d'après vous, cet architecte, on aurait pu réfléchir mieux les villes? Je suis algérien d'origine, on vit le même problème en Algérie. Est-ce qu'on aurait pu réfléchir ces villes mieux avec des architectes où vraiment, où le respect de la personne, ou le respect du mode de vie, on aurait peut-être le conçu des villes, peut-être ça aurait été mieux pour le mode de vie. Je ne sais pas ce que vous en pensez.
Moi, je ne pense pas, parce que les gens ne voulaient pas des médines. Et d'ailleurs, ce qui s'est passé en 1956, dès que les villes coloniales se sont vidées et que les Français sont retournés en France, immédiatement il y a eu une exode des médinas, donc des classes moyennes et supérieures, vers la ville nouvelle. Donc en fait, donc, je dirais que la Médina, jusqu'à aujourd'hui, on est en train de changer petit à petit, mais la Médina a une image donc, de régression, de manque de développement, etc. Donc ce que je dirais, c'est qu'il y a toujours un équilibre à avoir quand on est architecte, entre ce que les gens veulent et souhaitent, etc., mais aussi ce que l'architecture représente comme réflexion de son temps. C'est-à-dire on ne va pas construire des châteaux médiévaux aujourd'hui, même s'il y a peut-être des gens qui veulent ça. Donc voilà, c'est ce que je veux dire, il y a toujours une sorte d'équilibre, je dirais, entre les idées architecturales qui reflètent leur époque et les différents discours donc, de l'époque. Aujourd'hui, disons que c'est le discours sur la durabilité qui est très présent, et aussi, disons, les demandes, les besoins donc, de la population, des users, en fait, comment utiliser ces bâtiments.